And I think with that, I will introduce today's moderator. Catherine Turcer is the Executive Director for Common Cause Ohio and is co-leader of the Fair Districts Coalition campaign. She is an expert on redistricting reform and state-level campaign finance. Catherine advocates for greater transparency and more accurate government. Before joining Common Cause Ohio in April of 2012, she was Ohio Citizen Action's legislative director. Catherine, welcome.
Hi there. I'm so glad to be here today. And I have the opportunity of doing an interview with somebody who I always think is so interesting, and I want to hear his thoughts. And I know that you do too. So I highly encourage you to put your questions in the chat, because I'm not going to think of everything that we want to know from Kyle Kondik. So I want you to be sure to put those questions in the chat. So Kyle, I'm going to let you actually do the introduction for yourself. So we know that Kyle Kondik is with the Sabato crystal ball, and that he is, how can I put this, very expert in thinking about politics and talking about politics and guiding us as we consider the way forward when it comes to politics. And you know, when you're from Ohio, and I'd like you to tell us a little bit about kind of your early years, you know, where you're from, how you ended up at OU, and really like what led you to be interested in politics in the first place.
Thanks, Catherine. Thanks to the league for having me here today. Happy to talk to you all and answer your questions, try to shed some light on what I think is a pretty confusing and I'd say kind of controversial and difficult topic, which is redistricting and gerrymandering. So I'm from Independence in the Cleveland suburbs, just south on 77 from downtown, where all the hotels are, where people stay at for conventions and whatnot. I was born in Parma, but we moved to Independence when I was 2 or 3. And so I grew up there. My mom and my brother still live in Broadview Heights, and so we get back to Ohio pretty often. I've been with the University of Virginia Center for Politics and been the managing editor of our kind of flagship election newsletter, Sabato's Crystal Ball, for 10 years. We do election analysis, and so as part of that, I always try to keep an eye, particularly on what's going on back in Ohio. And so I'm able to talk to reporters from Ohio a lot and sources back in Ohio, et cetera. So I got involved in this job after I was part of then Attorney General Richard Cordray's administration. Of course, he's a Democrat who served for a partial term after Mark Dan had to leave the AG's office in 2008. So Rich got elected to that unexpired term in 2008. I joined the administration and basically as a speechwriter and did some other communications work for him in early 2009. I'd previously worked in newspapers in Northeast Ohio at the Chronicle Telegram in Elyria and Times Reporter in the New Philadelphia, Dover area. That was after I graduated from Ohio University with a degree in journalism in 2006. And I think just being in the news game and learning about journalism in college really got me interested in politics. I'd say, I'm 38. The big election when I was in college, of course, was Bush versus Kerry in 2004. I was working at the newspaper at that time, and that was sort of the first election that I really was interested in. A lot of people, I think they kind of they say, oh, well, I was involved in politics at an early age and whatnot. Like I really wasn't. And I was really more interested in history when I was a kid. But I sort of started studying like World War II and other stuff when I was in middle school, and that kind of led me to think about Churchill and FDR and other important historical figures, and that kind of led me into caring more about elections and politics. But a lot of what I know about it is kind of self-taught or taught through this job that I had. But anyway, that one political sort of government job I had was working for Cordray. We lost in 2010 to the now governor, Mike DeWine. And I was in a kind of an at-will position, so I had to find a new job. And I applied for the job down at Center for Politics and got it, and I've been there ever since. I do, we do ratings for House races, Senate, gubernatorial, and presidential elections when we have a presidential election. I'm kind of the main point person specifically for the U.S. House, and so that's what I study all of it, but I've spent a lot of time on the House, and I've had the opportunity to write a couple of books, The Bellwether, which is a history of Ohio and presidential elections. Of course, Ohio really isn't a bellwether anymore, but it was for a really long time. And so that book came out in 2016. And then I've got a book out that just came out earlier this year called The Long Red Thread about U.S. House. It's a history of U.S. House elections since the early 1960s. And that grew out of a master's thesis that I did at Johns Hopkins, their program here in Washington, that I did from 2017 to 2019. So that's how I got here.
Well, one of the challenges, for years, Ohio is kind of the swingiest of swing states. So goes Ohio, so goes the presidency. And I guess my first real question, especially because your book about the bellwether, has to do with, well, what is Ohio's role at this point in presidential politics?
So I think Ohio has pretty clearly become a right of center state in presidential elections. It typically did vote a little bit more Republican than the nation, prior to 2016, but we're only talking about maybe a point or two, and for a long stretch, no state better reflected the nation in presidential elections than Ohio did. From the last time it had voted prior to 2020, the last time it voted for the losing candidate was voting for Nixon over Kennedy in 1960. After that point, Ohio again usually was a little bit to the right of the nation, but voted very close to the nation. But I think what happened is that the Donald Trump candidacy kind of accelerated some trends that were already happening, kind of supercharged those trends in which white voters who don't have a four-year degree, many of whom live in kind of small town rural areas, the Democratic performance amongst those voters, which was already pretty poor, got way worse. And so you saw that in a lot of places in Ohio where Trump ran, ahead of usual Republican performance. He also flipped a lot of kind of blue collar, largely white working class areas. I guess the Youngstown Warren area is a great example of that. But and that sort of matched the trends we'd already seen prior to Trump in places sort of in eastern Ohio, kind of along the Ohio River, like Steubenville and Bel Air and some of those places. But also like Northwest Ohio, got a lot more Republican, and so the places that have shifted toward the Democrats in the Trump years, a lot of them are highly educated, growing, affluent, sometimes affluent suburban areas. I think like the northern Columbus suburbs being a great example of that. And so in some states, that trade-off has actually worked out pretty well for Democrats, like Virginia and Colorado, for instance, have become markedly more Democratic in recent years, in part because of those, big Democratic trends in places like Metro Denver and Northern Virginia, et cetera. But those trends have happened in Ohio. It's just that the way that Ohio is structured, it has a lot of kind of small town rural areas, a lot of white working class voters, and the Democrats have been losing those voters. And so while the trade-off is good for Democrats in some states, it's bad for Democrats, I'd say broadly in the Midwest, and Ohio is a good exemplar of that. So Ohio is sort of shifted to being I think a competitive state, but one where Republicans more clearly have the edge. And look, I mean, in state government, Republicans have been pretty dominant since the early 90s, with just a few little pockets of Democrats being able to win. Last time Democrats won the governorship was 2006. Democrats won the Ohio House for just a single term from 2008 to 2010. But I'd say kind of the federal level was more competitive, but federal level is beginning to look more like the state level in terms of that Republican lead.
Well, this leads us to gerrymandering. So one of the things, the League of Women Voters has worked on, making sure that those districts lines are fairer so that we have fairer elections and that we get the public policy that truly represents all Ohioans. And so, we went through this really heartbreaking, process where folks from all over the state went and testified, and we had protests and all of these different things. And so it's easy for us to feel like, oh my God, Ohio is the very, very worst when it comes to gerrymandering. I was kind of interested in I look at the Great Lakes states, and you have Michigan that has an independent commission. You have Missouri, you have Minnesota that's been in this court process for a while. Can you do a little bit of comparison, contrast between the different states and their redistricting process, and maybe like what worked, what didn't work?
Sure. Yeah, and just to warn you, I just got an alert that my internet connection says it's unstable. So I hope I'm not breaking up or anything. But I'm sitting right next to the router, so it's not going to get any better than this. So anyway, but so Michigan does have a new commission system. They have not finalized their maps yet. But that commission seems to be doing okay, I guess, or basically just sort of following it. I say that because in Virginia, the state where where my university is, UVA, they have a commission that was set up that had an equal number of Democrats and Republicans, and the commission failed to produce a map. So the Virginia Supreme Court is going to have to do that. Minnesota, part of the reason they go to court every 10 years is because Minnesota is often under divided government, and so it's been difficult for either side or for the two sides to come together to pass a map. That Minnesota's probably going to be there again because Democrats control the state house and the governorship, Republicans control the state Senate. Wisconsin also has divided government, so the state Supreme Court is going to probably end up drawing the lines there, although that Supreme Court, which has a 4-3 kind of Republican advantage, just like the one in Ohio does. And Wisconsin also has a sort of I think kind of a strange system in which judges are elected as technically nonpartisan, but sort of people who follow it know that there's clearly a Democrat and clearly a Republican. But they said that they're going to essentially use the existing maps as a template. Well, the existing maps are Republican gerrymanders, so Republicans will be just fine with that. Illinois is going to be a Democratic gerrymander. It was that the last decade as well. Indiana is a Republican gerrymander, although not a maximal one. And then Pennsylvania is another state with divided government where you saw the Democratic-run state courts intervene against Republican gerrymander last redistricting cycle, and got the Democrats a much better map in advance of the 2018 election. So you got a mix of the various kinds of redistricting systems in the Midwest. I would say that the use of commissions is certainly growing across the country. Those are happening out west. Many of the western states have kind of nonpartisan or bipartisan redistricting commissions, the West historically is sort of a region for reform in American political history. A lot of the Western states, for instance, were the first places to give women the right to vote, even before the nation did. Also, the West has been kind of a leader in vote by mail. A number of the states that have all mail voting or all vote by mail options. Those are those places like Colorado and Oregon and Utah, et cetera. But I would say that the idea of redistricting reform, I think, is sort of an idea whose time has come, in that you are seeing more states and more voters, when they get the opportunity to do so, try to change the system. It's just unfortunate that sometimes the reforms that are proposed don't actually maybe work. Although I would also say that the jury is out on Ohio, in that the Ohio Supreme Court is designed to be kind of the backstop for the process. Maybe they will kind of enforce changes to the maps, and if they do that and they sort of set that precedent, that might set things up better for for kind of fairer maps going forward. But it may ultimately be that reformers end up wanting to go to the voters with a different kind of system that might be a little bit, won't just require the Ohio Supreme Court to intervene, because it could actually produce maps that would be broadly acceptable in a kind of a more bipartisan or nonpartisan way.
So, and you mentioned reforms. So one, there are the independent commissions seems to be something that lots of people are thinking about. I know that lots of folks I talk to are like, okay, so we tried to, pass independent commissions, and you'll remember, 2005 with the Reform Ohio Now, and you'll remember 2012 with Voters First, and so this compromise, which is a little bit of a Frankenstein, was put together. But I was just wondering what you thought of independent commissions as a reform, and then I was also interested in, like, your thoughts about the Freedom to Vote Act and what will the likely consequences of that passage would be.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think that these commissions probably do need to be independent, and they also need to have some sort of tie-breaking mechanism, because if you, like the Virginia example, if you've got an even number of members, it's could potentially lead to deadlock. Although I guess the thing with the tiebreaker is that, invariably, I think the trouble with that is that it's going to be pretty hard to draw maps that everyone could be happy with. And it's not just the D's versus R's and whether a map, and there can always be changes made that would either maybe make the map fairer or benefit one side or the other. And ultimately, you can come up with hundreds, thousands iterations of maps, but you can only choose one, and it's hard to please everyone. And then you layer on top of that, there may be other kinds of advocates, like those who say that we should maximize the number of districts that are majority minority or are minority influence. The district should be compact. The district should be maximally competitive. And there's nothing inherently good or bad about those sorts of considerations. It's just sometimes comes up to personal preference, and you or I could have different opinions as to what redistricting should achieve, and neither of us necessarily would be wrong. Now, I do think that it's pretty clearly, I guess, sort of, maybe wrong is a strong term, or a strong word, but it's sort of distasteful, I guess, that in so many states, what ends up happening is that the party in power just gets to draw the lines and they benefit themselves. So, that sort of seems inherently kind of unfair. And I think that a lot of more and more people are sort of recognizing that. Just to give a brief little history lesson here, part of the reason I start my book on the House, The Long Red Thread, in the early 1960s is because that was the time of these landmark US Supreme Court decisions that essentially enshrined the concept of one person, one vote into redistricting. Prior to that, congressional districts and state legislative districts did not really actually have to have equal population. And so in the 1960 census, for instance, in some of the more egregious examples, both Texas and Michigan, for instance, had congressional districts where one district had 4 times the number of people that another district did. And this was amenable to particularly the rural interests, because cities and particularly suburbs at that time were growing. And so the sort of malapportionment of the legislatures and Congress allowed rural places to be overrepresented. And so as the result of kind of a long reform effort, in which people became more and more sort of aware of this population disparity problem, the Supreme Court finally acted in the early 60s, and that was one of the many kind of trailblazing decisions by the Warren Court. But the U.S. Supreme Court has never actually said that partisan gerrymandering is illegal, or at least they've never given any sort of indication that they would enforce standards about it. And that was, of course, reinforced in the Rucho v. Common Cause decision of a couple of years ago, in which the U.S. Supreme Court said, "Hey, we're just not going to get involved in partisan gerrymandering." Now, there are legal solutions in other places, but ultimately, to me, the most fruitful possibility for reform is that in states where at least there can be ballot issues, or maybe divided governments can be sort of convinced to go this way as a way to sort of make sure they're not shut out of the process next time, is to do some sort of reform. As for the federal legislation on voting rights, I mean, it certainly seems stalled at this point. This version, the most recent version of that bill, does not force the creation of independent commissions, but it does give guidelines, essentially federal guidelines for redistricting. And that might be, that to me seems like a reasonable thing to want to achieve. Just again, to sort of take the edge off of the kind of extreme gerrymandering that we see in some places. But again, barring a change to filibuster, that legislation seems, just the Republicans just are not interested in doing that. And you can sort of understand why, in that Republicans just control the gerrymandering mechanism, the redistricting mechanism, in more places than Democrats do at this point. It used to be reversed. In the 70s and 80s, the Democrats had a lot of that power, and the Republicans were the ones complaining about it. The Democrats didn't want to do anything about it then either. But I also think that, just generally speaking, kind of like big, broad, kind of kind of top-down reform efforts just seem to be something that Democrats are kind of more interested in these days anyway than Republicans. Kind of the old like progressive era impulse is just more in the Democratic Party. And look, Republicans sometimes say that, hey, these commissions end up being stacked against our party, and so therefore we shouldn't do them. And they could, I mean, in some places, I think you can make that argument, like California, for instance, although California is also an overwhelmingly Democratic state anyway, so it's no shock that the legislature there and the congressional delegation is also overwhelmingly Democratic, even though it's commission-drawn state. So, if that legislation would somehow pass, then we'd have to think about this again, but I'm sort of not holding my breath on it.
So this actually makes me think about kind of voting rights in general, because of course, this is all about, fair districts because of voting. It makes me think about voting rights, but that also then brings me to the thing that we have just really been challenged with, which is to do with misinformation related to elections. And so as you're doing kind of your analysis, I just wondered how you're looking at misinformation, how you're thinking about polling, how does that factor in that crystal ball? Like, how do you think about it?
Well, I mean, the polling has its own challenges, and it certainly seems like that, at least when Trump was on the ballot in 2016 and 2020, that particularly in the Midwest, that there was a certain kind of voter that the polls just weren't capturing. And I think that voter is probably a person who doesn't have much trust in there's a kind of a social trust that people sometimes ask about, and sometimes voters who have low social trust are not as likely to respond to polls. And look, response rates for polls are very low anyway. You need to contact, probably 10 times as many people as you actually can complete an interview with or more, just to be able to figure out your poll. So that's tricky. And again, they're just people that the polls don't necessarily capture. But then you have other places where the polls actually seem to perform pretty well. Like polling in Virginia, I think, was pretty decent in the most recent gubernatorial election. I mean, it showed a really close race that the Republican ended up winning by a very small margin, and Georgia too. So I think there does actually seem to be kind of a Midwestern problem, because you may remember that the polls in Ohio. I mean, there were several that showed Biden leading in Ohio near the end, and I mean, I still thought at the end of the day that Trump was going to carry Ohio, and of course he did, and it was essentially the same margin as 2016. So there's something a little amiss there, and in terms of misinformation. I mean, I think that a lot of the public is sort of radicalized in some ways, and part of that is, I think, because of it's so easy to get essentially kind of radicalizing a lot of times inaccurate information online. But I would also just say that the temperature in American politics is pretty high right now, which I think kind of leads to this sort of, again, this, I would call it like a radicalization problem. And, I'd say that the former president doesn't help matters by essentially arguing without producing solid evidence that, the election was rigged. And, he said the 2016 election was rigged too, and he won. So, I mean, we sort of all expected him to say these sorts of things, and there are a lot of people who believe him, or at least will, they prefer him to the Democrats, or they prefer him to the mainstream press, et cetera. So that's tricky. But from an election analysis standpoint, I think having sort of a healthy skepticism of the polls, while also sort of being able, that's the one way we have to really measure mass opinion, and it's better than the other methods that we have. But you just have to be kind of wary a little bit about not just picking races and thinking things are going to go the way that the polls suggest. Sometimes they work, sometimes they don't work as well.
You mentioned your book, The Long Red Thread, and I was interested in hearing a little bit more about it. Also, kind of in the context of John Boehner, and tell us a little bit about your book, and with an emphasis on Ohio.
So the book is, again, it's a history of U.S. House elections from 1964 to 2020, and it tracks. So it starts in 64. That, of course, is a big landslide Democratic election, and that is the post New Deal high watermark for Democrats in the House. They had, I think, 295 seats out of 435. And then sort of tracks kind of how the Republicans kind of ate away at that over time, which culminated in the 1994 Republican Revolution, which is the first time in 4 decades that Republicans have won the House. And 94 acts as sort of a demarcation point between an era where Democrats controlled the US House majority for almost all of the previous 6 decades, to a time where that both parties can win majorities, but by the end of this Congress, and of course the Democrats have a small House majority, the Republicans will have controlled the House majority for 20 of 28 years. And I think there are good reasons to believe that the Republicans are probably going to win the House next year. And it kind of tracks these sort of big picture trends in American politics, the nationalization of our results, political realignment, particularly in the South, and redistricting and reapportionment, which again used to be kind of more the preserve of Democrats. Now Republicans have more dominance there. And you look at those big picture factors, you put them together, and you say, well, the Republicans they're certainly not as dominant as the Democrats used to be in the race for the House, but they have some advantages now their advantages, I think, are more significant than Democrats' advantages in the battle for majorities.
Now, many of us are, familiar with, John Boehner's team weighing in on our maps in 2011, and, Tom Watman being, super engaged in the map making, and even, like a district line being moved for a donor, the Timkins, one of the things I've thought a lot about and wondered about is the responsibility for some of these senior folks who are no longer in office to address some of the problems with gerrymandering. And so, I thought, Steve Stivers, recently left the US House. Before that, he was an Ohio senator. He's now at the Chamber of Commerce. And just last week, he was essentially calling state legislators legislative terrorists. And so it started to make me think about, there are these people who have left, for lots of different reasons. But what are their responsibilities to kind of push reform or think about things differently, because they've been inside there. And especially with the kind of increased politicization and the tension being up, there's a responsibility for all of us as voters to do what we can. I wondered about what your thoughts were in that area.
Well, look, I mean, I think that, in some ways, I guess, office holders who are no longer in office, they don't necessarily have any specific responsibilities anymore. That said, we do sometimes culturally rely on kind of elder statesmen to be a little less partisan in their kind of post, office careers. And you do sometimes see former presidents sort of acting as kind of a public face for certain efforts, like hurricane relief or something like that. I mean, I think we've seen George W. Bush and Barack Obama do that sort of thing. Trump is in his own category because, he doesn't seem retired from public life the way that the other living former presidents, have been. Some have recently passed. I do think that it would be, I think it would be great if you did have elder statesmen kind of working in a way to kind of suggest kind of bipartisan or nonpartisan process improvements. And I would say redistricting reform is one of them. That seems like a good, fertile ground for that. But, frankly, I think also a lot of, it's sort of tricky for Republicans because they feel, I think they don't feel like they should be sort of working to disarm themselves after they've worked for decades to try to get the advantages that they now have. So from a partisan standpoint, I could sort of understand the resistance. But, on the other hand, I do think there's sort of a basic fairness problem with, a majority party being able to design lines for their own benefit. And again, you could say, oh, well, that's how it's always been done. And yeah, I mean, I think in a lot of ways that's true. That doesn't necessarily make it right, though.
Well, and, one of the, like many of us on this call, we're thinking about, well, how do we make improvements and what can we do? And there's a lot of worry about kind of the trends across different states. And maybe you can talk a little bit about this, about voting access. And you alluded to the states that have done a lot more of the vote by mail. what are you seeing as trends when it comes to making the ballot more accessible, making sure that folks have an opportunity to vote?
I do think the overall trend is positive in that if you're a believer that voters should have more options to participate, because with the general idea that more voter participation is a positive thing, I feel that way myself. And the institution I work for, the Center for Politics at UVA, our slogan is politics is a good thing. We are, we believe in civics education, and we believe in people participating in politics because it's, we just feel like that's sort of normatively important. And I would even say that in some of the states that have gotten criticized, I think from the left about, voter access, I guess Georgia is a good example. I'd still say that it's easier to vote in Georgia than it was 10, 20 years ago, in that they have, the voter registration has been on the rise there, in part because of, I think they do so-called motor voter registration in that state. Now, I do think that the intent behind some of the changes that have been made in some states is not, I don't think it's coming from a good place, because some of it seems predicated on this idea that, oh, well, the system was the reason why Donald Trump lost, and so therefore we need to change the system and discourage more participation. That's bad. But I also think that, there are many more states that have robust early in-person and mail, absentee or mail-in voting than they're used to. Some blue states have been kind of laggards in that regard, and we're seeing some of them try to improve. I do think that there are, I think that it's important for election authorities also to try to be as transparent and fast in the vote counting as possible, because unfortunately we're in an era of conspiracy theories, and if there's a sort of absence of complete information, that what fills that vacuum could be conspiracy stuff. So like New York State, for instance, and New Jersey have been, they haven't quite figured out the best way to count all the mail ballots so far, and that can lead to sort of skewed election results. Pennsylvania, and this is in part because the Republican legislature didn't, allow faster counting, but this, Trump saying, "Oh, stop the count," I was ahead, and then they took it away from me. They made up all the ballots. It's like, no, that was, we knew going to the election that the mail-in ballots were going to be very heavily Democratic. That's how it happened. They just got counted last. But if you have kind of cleaner, more transparent election administration, you give some of the kooks out there, they're still going to make bad arguments, I think, but you give them less ammunition, and you make it more transparent to the public. So that, to me, is important too. But I guess, I don't know. Maybe I'm not being skeptical enough of some of these things, but I would say the general trajectory in terms of voter access is probably positive in the sort of the longer term. Even though there have been things that have happened in recent months that some reformers have been a little skeptical of. One of the things that, in terms of Georgia, one of the things that I sort of don't understand quite fully about it, or I don't know the impact, is there may be some ways for basically the Republican-led legislature to kind of take over or sort of mess with the election administration in Fulton County, which is where Atlanta is, and it's the big, engine for Democratic votes. That stuff to me seems a little pernicious, because I worry about some sort of incentive to kind of take over some of the local machinery as a way to try to advantage themselves. So that's something that I would monitor with Georgia.
Well, this is the point that I'm going to ask you a few questions from the chat. So you mentioned Rucho v. Common Cause, and the question really was, is this something that the Supreme Court, meaning the US Supreme Court, is likely to reconsider?
I don't think this court is, because I think that the court has only gotten more conservative since then, and I think that conservatives on the court just sort of fundamentally don't believe in intervening in these redistricting matters. We know that Chief Justice Roberts doesn't want to, and I don't think that Amy Coney Barrett, who replaced Justice Ginsburg, is likely to want to intervene either. And again, if you're being a cynic, you could say, well, it's because they're Republican appointees and they don't want to mess with Republican control of redistricting. But you could also look at it from an ideological standpoint and say, well, conservatives don't want to get involved anyway. one of the old cases prior that was sort of was an earlier decision in which the U.S. Supreme Court did not get involved in malapportionment, what I was talking about earlier. The case, I think it was Colgrove v. Green from the mid-40s, and Felix Frankfurter, who was a Roosevelt appointee to the court, but who ended up being kind of conservative in certain ways. He referred to what he called the political thicket of districting, and he said, we don't want the court to be involved in this political thicket. And I suspect that there are a lot of members of the current Supreme Court who don't want to be involved in the political thicket. Now, one way in which the U.S. Supreme Court could sort of actively undermine state level reform efforts is by ruling that certain commissions are illegal because you can read the Constitution as saying legislatures have to do redistricting, and so therefore if voters would create a commission, that would essentially be unconstitutional. And there was actually a court case dealing with Arizona several years ago in which the court ruled in favor of the Arizona Commission, but it was 5-4, only 5-4, and I believe Roberts was a dissenter in that. So if a case like that came up to the Supreme Court, you could imagine that not only would the court not do anything itself to do away with partisan gerrymandering or to limit partisan gerrymandering, but they could actively undermine state level efforts to do so through this reading of the Constitution, which to me is I think that'd be unfortunate, because I think it would be kind of a highly legalistic view of things, and it would probably advantage Republicans, although there are certain states that have created commissions where Democrats probably wish they didn't exist now, like Colorado and Virginia, for instance, because those states could both be Democratic gerrymanders, but they're not because of the commissions. California is true too. Now, the California map was great for Democrats last cycle, but they also could hypothetically have gerrymandering power there if the commission didn't exist. So, and actually, if you just took all the commissions and threw them away and you devolved that power to the standard arrangement, the Republican advantage in redistricting would be less pronounced. So that's just something to keep in mind. But that's how if the Supreme Court is going to intervene at all, it might be to remove commissions or disempower commissions as opposed to doing something about partisan gerrymandering.
Well, and so many of us will remember that Arizona case, because in 2014, when the state legislature agreed to do the redistricting reform for state legislature, we didn't do Congress because there was this case, Arizona State Legislature versus the Arizona Redistricting Commission had not been decided. And that had to do with, exactly like, can you take this away from the legislature and give it to a legislative body? And so, that it's interesting to think that they could review that one. That's actually a little bit scary. Oh, I wanted to tell people too, if you go to Radio Lab has something called the political thicket. If you put that into your Google, you can actually listen to a discussion about what was happening in the 1960s and the fear of getting into the political thicket. And it's quite a good piece. So my kind of next question had to do with another reform, and that has to do with the Electoral College. Have you had thoughts about that?
I was just reading something this morning about that there are Democrats, and there are actually people across the political spectrum, although not necessarily Republicans in Congress, who want to basically try to change what some see as loopholes in I forget the name of the actual law, but it's the Electoral Vote Counting Act, which is essentially the people worry that's essentially if Mike Pence had decided that he actually had some sort of active role in counting electoral votes, sort of the kind of, I would say, kind of crazy legal theories espoused by like John Eastman in that memo. If you saw that story recently, basically saying that Pence could essentially declare the Michigan or some of the electoral votes to be invalid or not count them, and then that would throw the election to Congress or to the House, and the Republicans would control that mechanism, so they could have kept Trump as president. But it does seem reasonable to try to clean that up a little bit, to basically make it clear that certified electoral votes from states can't be overturned without, say, 2/3 majority in each house, because you could have a situation where a state would somehow send kind of fraudulent votes or contested votes or something, and you'd have to do something about that through Congress. But there was what happened on January 6th, showed that there might be sort of vulnerabilities in the system. Unfortunately, even a reform like that I think is basically technical in nature. I just don't know if there are enough Republicans who would go for it. I mean, again, there are conservative legal scholars who basically agree with the idea of doing something about it. But as for doing away with the Electoral College, I mean, that of course in the Constitution, that doesn't seem like a reform that's all that plausible. You have had this effort to create essentially an end run around the Electoral College, the national popular vote effort. I can't remember the exact name of it, but essentially, if you had 270 electoral votes from states sign on this compact, they would all agree to award their electoral votes to the popular vote winner, regardless of who won their actual state. Which that strikes me as a possibility, although you never know if one legislature would sign on to the compact and then someone else was in power at the time, could someone could a state pull out of that arrangement or what have you. So just like with so much else in the political structure of our country, it just seems hard to change these things, particularly at kind of a national level. And obviously, when something is in the Constitution, I mentioned that malapportionment of the legislature, the Supreme Court, did something about that. But of course, we still have a hugely malapportioned legislature, the Supreme Court or the U.S. Senate. But because the U.S. Senate structure is spelled out in the Constitution, the only way you could change it is if you amended the Constitution, which again doesn't seem particularly likely.
We had questions about a bunch of different reform options, and I was going to say before we completely wrap up, are there reforms that you've looked at as you've looked at all the different trends? Are there reforms that maybe they're not likely, but that you see a glimmer of hope?
I do think that there are growing efforts at the state level to kind of tamp down on, excessive gerrymandering. And again, even though I think the Ohio system doesn't seem like it worked, although the Ohio Supreme Court will again help determine whether it worked or not. But I think when voters get the chance to do something about this, they'd like to. And I think there's sort of a growing awareness about gerrymandering reform. And I think that if people who care about this in Ohio, and I'm sure the League of Women Voters is one of those kinds of groups, if they're, I guess it would probably be frustrating to have to sort of gear up again to do something about this. But if over the course of this next decade, you could say, hey, the system didn't work. We don't think there should be partisan gerrymandering. Let's go with, I don't know, something modeled on what Michigan is doing if Michigan's system ends up working. And again, that's a story remaining to be told. But it seems like that if you kind of reformers can sort of make the case on this, voters are willing to listen. Now, Ohio is fortunate in this regard that Ohio does have a system where, interested parties can sort of be able to present this directly to the voters. Some states don't have that. Like part of the reason Scott Walker was the former Republican governor of Wisconsin was recalled over labor law changes several years ago, was that the recall was really the only option for people who didn't like that law, because Wisconsin doesn't have a referendum initiative process. Some states don't, but some states do, and Ohio is one of them. And again, I think that the number of commissions is sort of growing, and while commissions are not perfect and they sometimes fail, again, I think that's probably better than the alternative, which is just majority party rule unchecked, which again seems sort of fundamentally unfair. So I do think some of those efforts will bear fruit. And again, the number of commission states has grown over the past few decades.
Well, I just have to say thank you as we had this conversation. I just really appreciate your answering my questions, and I actually appreciate ending kind of on a hopeful note. We've done this before, and I'm looking forward to us working all together to do our next big project to make voting better. And with that, I'm going to hand it off to my friend Iris.
Thank you. And thank you, Catherine, for being a fabulous moderator. And thank you, Kyle, for being moderated in such a lovely fashion. You see in front of you the two books that Kyle Kondik has written, and I urge you to pick them up.
There are signed ones at the Book Loft in Columbus if you're interested.
Oh, thank
I
you.
was there. I was there a month or two ago, and I signed a bunch. So they have. You can get them online too.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And you see his email there and website on the screen in front of you. Again, I am sending out a plea to all of you to support the League of Women Voters of Ohio. Please work with us to make democracy work. And again, the upcoming events: Wednesday, the Fair Districts All Volunteer Huddle; Thursday, the intersection between race, law, and democracy; and Wednesday, December 15th, Real Talk, League of Women Voters, Protect Honesty in Education, the Impact of Partisan Politics on Education. Reminding you that if you have young people who are working with your league, or who you know who might be interested, for ages 13 to 25, we now have Youth in Action, an activism opportunity for young leaders. And do join the league if you are not already a member. We encourage that, and then you'll get all of our messages all of the time. Again, thank you.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.